This is the Black Information Network Daily Podcast, and I'm your host, Ramses Ja. And sometimes the amount of stories that make their way to us means that we simply can't cover everything that comes our way. But from time to time, a story just stays with me, and I feel compelled to share it with you and give you my thoughts. And now, one more thing. Yannick Gill is a human rights lawyer based in Washington, D.C. Yannick worked in Congress with two progressive members of the House of Representatives. He is an accomplished human rights advocate defending marginalized people across the United States and abroad, and he is our guest today. This is the Black Information Network Daily Podcast, and I'm your host, Ramses Ja.
And I am Q Ward.
All right, so Yannick Gill, welcome to the show, man. We've been looking forward to having a conversation with you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. The pleasure is mine, Q. I'm really excited to be here. How y'all doing?
I'm doing great. So we talked a little bit about your background, but obviously it's a lot more extensive than that. What we do on the show, of course, is that when we have a guest such as yourself, we invite you to tell us a little bit more about yourself, just so our listeners are a little bit more familiar with who we're having a conversation with. So you can, start with where you were born, where you grew up, where you went to school, all those things. And then, of course, what led you to the conversation we're about to have today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you hit all the major points, but I'm a Florida man, proud of it, an HBCU grad, graduate of Howard University School of Law. And I think most importantly, when it comes to these conversations, I'm a Black man. I think there's so much happening, particularly if we're talking about 2024, with conversations around who we are, how we view things. And my identity doesn't stop when I put on the suit, does not stop when I enter into a workplace. And so although I have worked on issues of democracy, human rights, migration policy, all across the United States and the world, I kind of start that analysis and those thoughts from my background. When I walk into the room, you don't see my degree, but you definitely see my skin. And that is part of what I bring to any conversation, to include this campaign.
I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you for carrying your Blackness into every room with you. As you can imagine, that is also something that we don't have a choice in the matter of, and we don't pretend that, no matter how many radio stations or how many, interviews that we get to do, that it's something that we cannot take off or cover up with our suit or our degrees or our awards. So I just want to, thank you for stepping into rooms the way that you do. On that note, racial justice is an obvious big deal and factor in this upcoming election. With you, given your education and experience, we just want you to share your thoughts on the contrast between the competing administrations for our vote, between, the Harris administration and the administration of our former president. Go through a few things and educate us on how life could be very different, given the two potential candidates.
And contrast, I think, is the word of the day. Just because it almost feels laughable that we're in a situation where we actually have to compare point for point. So first, I'll use those degrees you talked about and discuss policy, but then we just need to, I think, have a call-in moment amongst ourselves and really understand what we're talking about.
Sure.
But policy is easy. The first thing that comes to my mind is the criminal justice reform component. There's a strong narrative around Vice President Harris being a cop. But let's not be confused. When it comes to criminal justice matters, former President Donald Trump has shown how he sees us. You can go back to the Central Park Five. We can go down to his criminal convictions. We can go down to multiple comments on record with how he sees us as thugs and how he sees us as people in need of some sort of handout. And the contrast is clear with the excitement around the opportunity agenda for Black men. I think I'm going to point to some of those policy issues, whether it be police accountability, whether it be access to the criminal justice system that goes beyond simply listening to the police. When we are placed into precarious situations caused by over-policing. The comparisons are stark access to the voting booth is something that our forefathers have been fighting about. And we see it in different states across our country where they're trying to limit who has access to voting. This is something that Vice President Harris has not only spoken to, but has said that she will continue to advocate for. We can also talk about access to capital for small business ventures. The list goes on. I could talk about healthcare. I could talk about access to cryptocurrency. The beauty of Blackness is that we're not monolithic, and the different policy issues that I'll bring up will make certain people's ears perk up and other people close their eyes. But don't be fooled. If we Google, just go on the simple website and Google whatever issue is most important to your day-to-day, to your family, to your community. Vice President Harris has shown that she has plans that will directly impact us in ways that the former president has shown that he simply does not care.
Yeah, there's a lot that's being said about Project 2025, of course, and how problematic that is for America in general. And in like particular specific terms, how problematic that would be for those of us who have historically been marginalized in this country. And even though Trump has tried to distance himself from that agenda, his Agenda 47 does not speak to what his administration plans to do to earn the trust and the respect of the Black community in the way that Kamala Harris's does. And again, we're not trying to be biased here. It's just that Kamala Harris, again, has a very specific agenda for Black people and Black men in this country, whereas Trump's Agenda 47, the one thing that he has said that he is behind, does not. So I want to make sure that that's stated here too. And then, I don't want to give him a free pass on that, distancing himself from Project 2025, because we know full well the authors of Project 2025 are people that work very closely with him. And, his name is mentioned in the document hundreds of times. So it's specifically for his administration. But, my assumption here is that he had to come up with something to pivot because Project 2025 was not polling well. And so that's where Agenda 47 comes from. But in our estimation around here, the thrust of his agenda is in Project 2025. Now, you mentioned that, there were people that have different issues that are important to them. And that is why they would or would not vote, or they would vote for one candidate or the other. And I understand that. On our shows that Q and I do, we speak to a number of different groups. You mentioned that Black people are not a monolith. We speak to allies of Black and brown people, of course, and everyone in between. But one element that we cannot overlook, just because of the nature of the type of program that we create, is sort of like the activist element. And this element can and historically has taken issue with Kamala Harris's relationship to police. These folks who have been out in the streets protesting police systems and systemic injustice at the hands of the carceral system to marginalized communities. Now, we've had conversations on this show, almost, I'll say bringing, what's the word I want to say? Bringing insight, clarity, perspective to her history as a prosecutor. We would like for you to do the same. Could you speak to people who might have reservations about voting essentially for a police officer, the top cop, when they historically have felt like police have done harm to Black and brown communities?
This is an issue that, in full transparency, I'm grappling with. I say activist before lawyer. I say advocate for lawyer. And as I said, at the end of the day, I close my eyes as a Black man. Mm-hmm. And the idea of advocating for someone who has such intimate ties to policing was something that I really had to grapple with for some time. But I'm going to go back to the word of the day, which is contrast. Again, when we're looking at the big decision that we all have to make in the next 2 weeks, we have a choice between someone who has unapologetically targeted people that look like me and you. We have a contrast between someone who has advocated for the return of stop and frisk, of unabashed qualified immunity. We have someone that has highlighted and, quite frankly, benefited from some of the ugliest parts of policing in the United States, which, let's be clear, in a Harris administration, there's a lot of work to do to improve policing. The George Floyd Justice and Police Act has not been passed, and it's something that would only begin to get us moving in the right direction.
Right.
But when I'm considering and thinking through the relationship of Vice President Harris with the police, I'm thinking about someone that has shown that she's willing to come to the table and actually have a conversation about these issues. I'm talking with someone that has shown that from her first initial run for president, that she has moved to the left on a lot of these issues, to include policing. I'm looking at someone that cares about our community in ways that go beyond fodder. They go beyond just placating us with fancy words. There comes a point that is coming quickly where we have to think through what issues are going to bring us out and which issues are going to stop us. And it's cliche, but in this election, we really have to consider that for every person that is not sitting down because of her views on policing, immigration, national security, there's someone who is jumping out of their seat and bringing all their friends to vote for Donald Trump, regardless of what he called us, who he assaulted, which laws he's broken. We tend to be often very cerebral with our choices in ways that the other side is not. And I don't think that we have this luxury this election. The conversations need to be had and will be had, hopefully next year with an administration that'll actually invite us to the table.
You know, one of the things that keeps me up at night, and that's something that I borrowed from Ambassador Susan Rice, is exactly what you just said. It's like we collectively look for reasons to disqualify a candidate, and the other side has determined there is no such thing. They're going to vote for their guy no matter what. Even the way that they campaign seems to have nothing to do with policy anymore, just popularity. What things will get the most clicks, what things will rile his base up the most, and even support from other conservative candidates that have, throughout their entire political history, really demolished him as a person, as a human, and claimed him to be unfit, have now gone the way of, well, he's the most popular, so let me just align myself with him. In this way that he seems to be impenetrable or bulletproof with regard to his behavior, his rhetoric, he brags about things that we would bristle at. You know, he brags about getting rid of Roe v. Wade, and most recently on television, very, broad-chestedly bragged about his desire to get rid of the Department of Education. Again, I want us to make the contrast clear. He's saying no Department of Education, no funding to, schools or states that teach children about the real history of this country. Our current vice president, I'm sure, has some very different ideas with regards to education.
And I think the commentary, it's easy to get stuck on it, right? Oh God, I can't believe he said that. Why would he say something like that? But we really have to think about, again, the real world implications of it. I talked about I'm first gen this, first gen that, saying it plain, without things like Pell Grant, I wasn't going to school. My family did not have it. And these government policies changed my life. Who's in charge of that? Department of Education. Cutting away those things, it sounds like a headline until you really think about the real world implications that it has on our communities. Again, getting rid of Roe v. Wade. Again, it just sounds like a headline. until you're seeing people in some of these states die because they don't have access to basic healthcare that we all thought was a given decades and decades ago. I think it's really, really important to remember that this language isn't just language. All of these things have real world implications. Before, we can go back to Reconstruction. They're taking our women. That led to over policing of Black men. Before, immigrants are taking our jobs. That led to direct attacks on the immigrant community. Stops by police, asking them to check papers as though we're in a Nazi era country. We're now in a place where he's casually joking, Haitians are eating our pets. What is happening to that community? We don't have to ask. Death threats, bomb threats to communities where there are large populations of Haitian immigrants. This is more than just words. And we really have to think through, is a tax deduction, is a quote unquote popular, cool, hip president something that you're willing to ignore, someone that you're willing to celebrate, when we have seen how his words, his actions are quickly supplemented by policy? Again, we can talk for hours about all the things that happened that seemed like a lifetime ago. The Muslim ban, Roe v. Wade, policing, or we could just take
affirmative action.
There we go. Mm-hmm. Don't get me started on the education part, but it will only get worse. He had to consider before a re-election campaign. This time he doesn't. It's going to be worse this time around.
So, that brings me to the thought, because he's not the president right now. And yet his words have enough power to bring great harm to huge populations in this country. You mentioned the Haitian immigrants who are here legally working, bolstering the economy. And because he decided to lean into something that was not even true, not just the Haitians, but the entirety of that community has suffered as a result of it. And because this is a nation of 350 million people, give or take, it's really easy for that town to have their, 15 minutes, worth of headlines, and then the rest of the country just kind of moves on beyond it. And people forget again that the scale of this man's words ramps up when he is the president of the United States again. So I think your point is well made. And I think that has something to do with the population here. There's something particularly about the MAGA group, in my estimation, that is kind of flipped on its head. And of course you can, share your thoughts on this, but my belief has always been that historically the people elect a person to represent their interests. They elect a person who will do the things that represent them. And I think that this is flipped on its head, because I believe that the people are now representing Donald Trump. And they like, it's almost like it brings out the worst in people, because it's not Donald Trump who's actually on the ground in Colorado, affecting the immigrants. It's not Donald Trump who's, on the ground in the day to day with, people at work, people, at the dinner table, people, out in the streets, people waving their Trump flags. And, I saw a video, of a bunch of Trump trucks in Texas, trying to run a bus off of the road not too long ago. Mm-hmm. Those are his people. And they are now representing Donald Trump rather than the other way around. And I don't know if that speaks to, you mentioned, education. I don't know if that speaks to, an uneducated or a lesser educated electorate than we prefer. But, just kind of speak to your experience on, kind of covering those headlines and maybe what you make of whether or not the people are taking on Donald Trump's traits, or if I'm just crazy and I'm just seeing things.
Well, you're definitely not seeing things.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, we've all been having the same visions for the last
Thank you.
I think it's really scary, quite frankly. I share with you, I'm a proud Florida man. I grew up in West Palm Beach, Florida, which is the last blue part before things get really, really red in the state of Florida. I say that to say I've been rubbing shoulders with people across the partisan lines my entire life. And I think what has been jarring, seeing Trump's presence in the political sector, is seeing Christian, suburban, proud families supporting someone committing sexual assault, supporting someone who proudly cheated on his wife, paid off a porn star. Yes, I'll keep it with that sort of issue because it speaks to just how out of character Trump's presence has made people become. They're no longer thinking which candidate most aligns with my values, which candidate most benefits my family. What they're really considering is which candidate aligns with my party affiliation. That's the start and end of the analysis. Yeah. They fall directly in line and will repeat whatever it is that he's saying. And to your point, you see it with the representatives. Again, there was a bipartisan immigration bill. And speaking candidly, y'all, it wasn't my favorite bill. There was a lot more that we could have done for the immigrant community than what was in that bill.
Okay.
But it was the metaphorical step in the right direction. But even that bipartisan bill, Trump, who was not the president, as you noted, was able to shut that down. Let's be clear, he's not the president, but he's definitely still in charge of the party. And until the American people wake up and recognize a lot of the distress that's been going on, a lot of the chaos that's happening in DC, that he is behind, we'll continue to put it aside and talk about whether or not Kamala has always identified as Black, which is foolish. Or we could actually have policy discussions and think, why is it that this person would represent us on an international scale? Sure. And again, having done work on this, not just in the US, but abroad, while Trump was at the helm, it was much harder to do work to benefit the lives of people because they would point a finger back at me and say, what's happening in your country? I don't want that for another 4 years.
You know, just the possibility of him once again being in that office is scary beyond just living here. Because I hear people saying, you know, if he wins, we'll just pick up and move somewhere else. Well, I don't know where in the world would be safe.
Where can
with
you go?
Him at the helm of the largest, most well-funded and powerful military in the world, and having decided anybody that disagrees with him is an enemy who he will point his weapons at is a really, really scary prospect. So I couldn't imagine you being in a position to have to try to work and negotiate, you know, while he was the person who everybody thought was in charge. Last night, Ramses and I had a conversation with a really powerful group of Black men here in Phoenix, Arizona. And one of the gentlemen who could have been our father stood up in that conversation and talked about the lack of power that the Black vote has and feeling like his vote didn't matter. And when we see how hard the other side is trying to make it for us to vote and how clumsily they pander for our attention and our vote, selling sneakers and gold watches and parading rappers on stage.
Washed up rappers.
I think it's very, very clear that not only do our votes matter, but that our votes have power in kind of finalizing a lot of these decisions and winning a lot of these races. Talk about, you know, your experience or your vantage point on what we've seen in kind of overtly trying to block us from exercising that right to vote and having access to the ballot box.
Yo, we don't have to dig that deep. Think about Georgia. The bill got a lot of attention when it passed, and then we kind of forgot that it happened. But they made it illegal to pass out water to people standing in line to vote. I lived in Atlanta, Georgia for a chapter before moving to DC. And I thought it was normal to be required to stand in line for between 4 and 6 hours Now, I was working at a law firm at the time, so saying, hey, y'all, I'm going to vote. Everyone said, oh, me too. We actually carpooled over and we all stood in line together. But if you have a phenomenal job, you could be a manager at Marshall's. You could be a school teacher. You can work in television. All jobs don't have that flexibility to sacrifice between 4 and 8 hours to cast a vote. You might have family commitments. You might physically be incapable of standing in a line that long. All of those barriers that they have now codified in certain states across our country make it harder to vote. You're completely right. Why would legislatures in all 50 states be attempting to make it that much harder to vote if our vote doesn't matter? Why would they be banning books if what's reading in those books didn't matter? Why would they be destroying the Department of Education if going to college and advancing your degrees didn't matter? You can follow the actions and the policies happening on the other side and know what they deem important. And let's be clear, our vote still matters. Of course it matters, which is why saying washed up rapper even feels generous when they had Amber Rose rapping about Trump. It is truly the definition of pandering.
Yeah.
So the idea of how they treat us, how they look at us, to be met with an apathy, saying that our vote doesn't matter, is dangerous. And it speaks to the forgetfulness that people tend to have around all the things that happened during the Trump administration, but more importantly, just the things that happened to our grandparents, to our parents. We have an opportunity to change things, and we cannot get bogged down on the nuances and intricacies of some of this policy. Like I said, I could talk about the immigration bill. I could talk about policing. There's a lot that the administration will have to do to get us all on one accord. But Kamala Harris has shown that she's willing to do that work. Like I said, who's going to actually invite the Black community, the brown community, marginalized people in a significant way versus sending us ugly gold shoes to purchase? Some things were what, $300? It's laughable. It's laughable.
The watch is 100,000.
See, not even
And 800.
Oh yeah, there's an $800 watch and a $100,000 watch. Those are the only two options.
Awesome.
Yes, that's how he sees the community. There it is.
Okay. So you mentioned a couple of things in this conversation. I think it's really important for our listeners to get inside of your mind. You have a perspective a lot of people don't have. I'm personally excited to, hear your thoughts or hear your explanation here. You mentioned that Donald Trump effectively tanked the bipartisan border deal, which is why we have a quote unquote border crisis right now. He did that so that he would have something to campaign on, something to point at the current administration and say, see how they're failing you. I will step in and I will fix this problem. So it's effectively a problem he prevented from being fixed so that he could say, look, they have this problem that I can solve. Right. And from his side, I'm sure he was thinking that that would work because his first administration succeeded by campaigning on build that wall. So he's, reverted to the textbook fear mongering that the immigrants are coming in and they are going to take your jobs and they're going to eat your animals and they're criminals and they are bringing drugs and all this sort of stuff, right? They're going to come and rape all your kids. Just the worst things that he can say about this unknown element that people in Utah and, Wisconsin and Maine and, places like that can be afraid of, even though it could not impact them. Mm-hmm. It's just enough to cause them to be afraid. The thing is, people, it's hard to get people to be afraid of something they know very well. It's a lot easier to get people to be afraid of something they don't know. And most of the country does not live in Arizona, like a border state like this. You know, we got basically Texas, New Mexico, us, and California. And we're the ones who we live with immigration, you know, like the immigration that they're trying to use to stir up this fear around the country. So this is where I want to kind of get in your head, and I want to take our listeners into your head, being someone who has worked with immigrants in the immigrant population. Explain to us what immigration does for this country positively, like why we have immigration in the first place, why it's necessary, and help dissolve some of the mystery around quote unquote immigration so that it cannot be weaponized against us the way that it is being weaponized against us by Donald Trump. So let's bring some humanity and some logic to why we have immigrants coming into this country in the first place.
You know, that is such a beautiful question, because I sometimes forget. I'm growing up in Florida, living in DC now, connections to New York. Not everyone is going to break bread with an immigrant once a week, if at all, before the age of 18. And it's something that a lot of us can take for granted. The first thing I'm going to say is that there are dozens of countries with which people immigrate from to the United States. And each immigrant's experience is going to be different. As I said, I'm the child of Black immigrants from Guyana. Their experience was completely different than someone that came from Finland, someone that came from Haiti, someone that came from Mexico. So to speak to the immigrant experience and a sort of soundbite is an impossibility. But what I will say is that the monolithic analysis of what immigrants are doing is foolish. There are several different economies across our country that survive because of immigration. There are people who call the loves of their wives, their husbands, love only because of immigration. We call it expats, but Americans continue to travel to other countries because of access to immigration. To simply state that immigrants are dangerous, that immigrants are coming and stealing jobs, it's all based in ignorance. Talk to any small business owner in almost any state across the country. They have interacted with the immigrant community in some way, shape, or form. Most immigrants, and there's data to support this, come to this country simply to work, and factually, and there's data to prove this, they commit crimes at margins, huge margins, less than Americans. Think about it. If you know that you are able to provide education to your children, to get a great paying job, to feel safe and see a future growing, many of the things that the United States is able to provide to the immigrant community, why risk that for petty theft? Why risk that for some of the for fentanyl distribution? Again, it's fear mongering. And because we are living in a time where the former president can accuse the community of eating cats and dogs, and everyone nods and smiles, immigrants will always be that scapegoat. You may have seen, y'all, there was an interview just this week where a Fox anchor pushed back on that lie. He said, hey, there's no way. It was been disproven. Haitians aren't eating cats and dogs. The president then turned around and said, but what about the geese? This is the time that we live in. I could continue to talk about some of the problems with the idea of the American dream. I acknowledge my bias as someone who's advocated for the rights of asylum and the importance to have diverse communities, the data that proves it and that shows it. Or we could just take a step back and think at our country's beautiful history, We are a nation of immigrants. We've all heard the adage that the only true Americans are the Native Americans who are here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think starting with that foundation and understanding that all of us, Black Americans included, were brought here in different situations under different circumstances, we'd recognize that it is simply a scapegoat to blame the economy, to blame crime, to blame any of this nonsense on the immigrant community. It's an unfortunate reality that we are at a point where the humanity of immigrants are being questioned. But it's a poignant question because they continue to be at the crosshairs of policies from the Trump administration. And while things aren't perfect with the D's, as I said, who is going to invite us to the table to have substantive policy-changing conversation in contrast with sinking a bill that would have allowed for more judges, that would have provided technology to better assess immigration cases? No, instead they're voting for someone that said we need a wall and a moat. This is not Game of Thrones. It does not make any sense that this is our comparison. Immigration policy is very complicated, but a love for your fellow man is not. And that's what we really have to keep at the core when we're talking about immigration policy.
You know, sometimes I fear that the former president has made himself such a cartoonishly ridiculous person that some people who should take him very seriously consider him like this benign clown where they explain away and kind of saying wash everything he says as sort of non-threatening. Their ability to other us and drive wedges between large groups of the population that have so much in common, right? We can take groups of poor people and say, yeah, you're all poor, but they're Black.
Mm-hmm.
You know, take groups of immigrants. Yeah, you're all immigrants, but they're Black immigrants. They're Haitian, they're Cuban, they're from, you know, what he referred to as S-hole countries from all over the world. Being able to draw this divide, you know, some people ask, you know, again, referring to this conversation last night, how are there Black people that show up to support this man? And if you take some of those Black people and make them feel like they are better and more like you, and those that are poorer or immigrants are less like you and more likely to hurt you or your children or commit crimes, and all these fear-mongering lies that they tell, I'd like to know who on that side would be able to point to Ramses and I, be able to point to you and say, well, he's not Haitian, he's not Cuban, he's not African, and I'm leaving that blank because you have Afro-Latina, you have African, you have West Indian, you have all of these different variations of people who, if you're just looking at their skin and most of their features, could be kinfolk.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us more about that type of rhetoric where I think people think they're excluded, right? You see people who look, and some might speak similar to the very targeted group of Haitian immigrants now. And I think they feel they would be excluded from those attacks and from that policy of these mass deportations that he talks about. Speak to how scary that should be. And I hate to try to use the same tactic, so maybe not scary, but point to more what that could look like for all of us. Because I don't think every Haitian walks around with the flag that says, hey, I'm Haitian, deport me. I think our brothers and sisters from the Haitian community could use our support because they are far more like us than different.
And I couldn't have said it better myself. It's really one of those issues that I, again, forget is even an issue. If I were to say, y'all were my cousins, no one would bat twice.
Mm-hmm.
Until maybe you started to ask certain questions about curry or roti or dal curry. But one of the most brilliant things I heard at my first week at Howard was look around the room. Although it seems as though we are all the same, because we are, our differences show up when you're invited to grandma's house for breakfast. And you kind of see and hear the smells, the music, the outfits, perhaps. But that requires actually getting to know that individual. we are all coming from the same place. Whether you go to an anthropological level, and we're talking about the first humans, or we're talking to the Black people specifically, at which point the slave ship dropped us off. Let's be clear, the policies that are being implemented looking to target the immigrant community will impact anyone that is perceived to be an immigrant. And that changes not just from state to state, but from city to city. I have never been thought to be Habesha until I moved to DC. In the same way that if I'm in Detroit, I might be Somali. In the same way that I'm going to New York, I speak my little Spanish, I can suddenly be Dominican. But at the end of the day, it's because we're all Black. These policies that seek to target certain parts of the community will inevitably impact us all. One of the most dangerous but effective strategies that we have seen implemented are those that seek to divide and conquer. And it works. And it's worked, whether it be through slave revolts or with the recent conversations around ADOS. Let's be clear, I support reparations until I get to certain conversations or certain places where they say, oh, well, that has nothing to do with you. Your parents were born in South America. That's taking away one more voice to advance policies that would just at large benefit our communities. And I think this idea of saying that these issues won't impact me and mine directly, I won't say that it's scary, but I will say that it's short-sighted and misinformed. Okay. Whether it's a situation of access to capital, everyone loved to talk about how Trump, he gave those checks. Everyone got the checks. But if you are attacking different protections that have always protected our community, whether it be housing discrimination, whether it be access to higher ed, whether it be access to capital loans for small businesses, if you're removing any of those protections because he wrote you a check, where are you spending that check? We really have to get beyond the immediacy of all of these issues. We really have to be able to see ourselves in our brothers and our sisters, because for whom the bell tolls today could be for you tomorrow. These issues will impact generations of people to come, and we've seen that he won't stop. Roe should be a scary example to us all. Again, Black women are dying in Texas and in Georgia from preventable surgeries because of laws that he has proudly supported. And I think you're right. This idea that he is just a clown is working. And we got to wake up. His words are very dangerous. And we can't wait until they're knocking at our door, making things dangerous for us, then suddenly care.
There's a couple of things that I want to, or one thing in particular that I want to touch on before I ask the second thing. And feel free to jump in, but Donald Trump didn't write anybody a check.
Thank you.
We've said this before. But,
yes.
Yeah, that for folks because that is, to be fair, that is something that people sincerely believe.
Truly believe.
In case you're only getting this episode and you haven't got the rest of them, I apologize, but I have to say this every time I have a mic in an audience because, in our estimation, Q and myself, we feel the stakes are so high that it's worth you hearing this twice if it means someone else gets to hear it once. So I will say that it was Congress that approved.
A Democratic Congress
that approved those checks. Donald Trump stood in the way of you getting those checks until he could get his name on the check, and he bypassed Congress. I believe it was Ambassador Rice that explained that to us more fully, but bypassed Congress and went to the head of the Treasury to insist that the checks not be sent out unless they had his name on it.
His name.
Right.
The branding.
Right. So the check came with a signature and I believe maybe some other information that suggested that Donald Trump was the person behind it. And for people that feel like Donald Trump went to his own bank account, pulled out money and gave it to the American people, you're playing right into his hands. You're falling for the trick that he wanted you to fall for. He's a showman and you're dancing to his tune. Donald Trump did not send you that money, nor would he ever send you that money. The money was already earmarked for you, and he wanted to take credit for it. So that's the person, for those of you who feel like you want to vote for him over the $1,200 that Congress approved for you. That's the person that you're really voting for. Nobody, he didn't send you that money. Have to say that. Next thing I want to say, and I know that we're going long on time, but I would appreciate your insight, because you are a person who is more familiar with the average American with the legal framework of this country. You mentioned to us that we don't need to look much further than Roe v. Wade. And, you know, on this show, we've discussed Roe v. Wade many times. And so our assumption is that our listeners are familiar with that. That Supreme Court has stood in the way or repealed so many things that people who prefer a more progressive agenda want to see happen. A lot of people got some form of student loan relief. I was not one of them. So, you know, there's a lot of like really scary things with respect to that Supreme Court. And we don't necessarily need to talk about Donald Trump or his decidedly conservative agenda, whichever you think that he is going to enact when he becomes president, be it Project 2025 or his Agenda 47. It's Project 2025. But what I want to do is to sort of ask you, you know, for those of us that look at this situation and realize, or feel rather, that it's very bleak, even if there is a Harris administration on the horizon for us as a country, the Supreme Court is there. As a lawyer, as someone who's familiar with the legal framework of this country, what, if anything, can be done about the Supreme Court in terms of pushing through a progressive agenda for this country?
Well, I'm so happy that you ended that question with the word progressive, because as a progressive myself, and with many progressive in Congress, there has been a conversation around expanding the court for years at this point. Mm-hmm. We have to start taking these policies seriously. We have to start to consider ways to inhibit SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, from determining what our fundamental, sometimes constitutionally guaranteed rights will look like in the future. This country was supposed to have checks and balances, and we have allowed for President Trump to stack the court with far-right, politically motivated justices. Unless we do something to radically change the way that looks, whether it be court expansion or Supreme Court terms, this will continue to be an issue. And it goes far beyond Roe v. Wade. This has to do with the EPA. This has to do with student loan forgiveness that I too wish I could say I got. This has to do with immigrant rights, like we've discussed. It has to do with qualified immunity and how policing is done in this country. Our courts are meant to be a check on Congress, meant to be a check on the president. And they have been terribly, terribly politicized in a way that, without that same progressive thought process, without changing things from the way they've always been done, we will continue to be at the mercy of justices that have shown time and time and time again that they will not answer to us and that they don't necessarily care about us. Something has to change. I think we have to change the way that judges are operating, particularly our justices in this country. Otherwise, we're going to continue to run into these same issues, if not worse issues.
It's very refreshing to have this conversation with you. You know, I had to pay all of my student loans back, and I still hope they forgive even more for those who haven't gotten that relief yet. The idea that some people are upset that because they had to pay their loans back, that they should stand in the way of other people getting theirs forgiven is crazy to me. But
good Christian ideology.
Oh yeah, absolutely. What would Jesus do? Thank you for shining a very pragmatic light on some of these issues that, like I said, I think the clown of a former president that we had has made a lot of these issues seem very cartoonishly frivolous, and people just kind of ignore the extreme things that he says. So, thank you for lending your point of view and your perspective on things that you have a greater understanding of than the two of us. For our listeners, what's next for you? I know this election is mission critical for everyone, but there's work to be done beyond that. So what's next on your itinerary, and how can people keep up with you and follow you and all those great things?
Yeah, absolutely. I revel in the opportunity to have more conversations like this, because I think, to your point, we often limit these conversations to the ivory tower. And I always tell people, I'm not smarter than you. I've just created a life where I'm able to get paid to read. But if someone else had a paycheck tied every time they read the news and kind of kept up with some of these policies, they could figure it out too. This stuff isn't complicated. But if the only time that you are hearing about it is for 45 minutes right after you put the kids away and you're feeding yourself some cold leftovers, you're not going to be able to get into those intricacies and how it directly impacts you, what they're saying about people across the sea and people in a different city. That being said, over the next 2 weeks, my primary goal is to make sure that Vice President Kamala Harris is in office, whether that be volunteering my time, knocking on doors, calling my cousins and them to make sure that they are registered and showing up and taking a few long friends. That is really what my foreseeable future looks like. We can have this conversation a week after the election, and I might have a more exciting agenda. But for me, it's just incredibly important to combat disinformation, to share the good word, and make sure that people understand how this election is not something high and lofty in policy and legal conversations, but how it directly impact what the next 4 years of their life at a minimum look like. My name is Yannick Gill, Yannick Gill, and while not the easiest to pronounce, it makes Google very easy. So I'm able to be kept up with through a simple Google search. And it's Yannick Gill with most everything.
All right. You probably didn't mean it this way, but Ramses and I both just heard you say we could talk about this again in a couple of weeks. I'm going to take that as a promise. I'm not sure if that's what you meant, but you said it, and I got
your mouth,
recorded.
you guys is. Now I'm holding y'all accountable.
Okay. There it is.
There it is.
Let's get it. All right. Well, in the short run, we got to say thank you. Obviously, this conversation was a long time coming, and it's you and people like you that give us and our listeners the insight that we need to really make heads or tails of things day to day. Your expertise on immigration, just the fact that you're a lawyer with the perspective of a Black man, goes a long way, because, we're having conversations about Blackness. We're having conversations about the law. We're having conversations about immigration. And so someone with your unique perspective and experience in the political arena, it's an honor, and it's a joy, and it's exceptionally educational to have a little bit of your time, and the promise that we will have more of your time in the future. So on behalf of myself and Q, all of us here at the Black Information Network and at Civic Cipher, we want to say thank you, not only for your time, but for your commitment to making sure that we are all more educated and more engaged. You're the sort of person that we simply can't thank enough. Once again, today's guest is Yannick Gill, a human rights lawyer and accomplished human rights advocate defending marginalized people across the United States and abroad. Thank you, sir.
No, the pleasure was mine. Thank you, y'all.
This has been a production of the Black Information Network. Today's show was produced by Chris Thompson. Have some thoughts you'd like to share? Use the red microphone talkback feature on the iHeartRadio app. While you're there, be sure to hit subscribe and download all of our episodes. I am your host, Ramses Ja, on all social media.
I am Q Ward on all socials as well.
Join us tomorrow as we share our news with our voice from our perspective, right here on the Black Information Network Daily Podcast. This has been a production of the Black Information Network. Today's show is produced by Chris Thompson. Have some thoughts you'd like to share? Use the red microphone talkback feature on the iHeartRadio app. While you're there, be sure to hit subscribe and download all of our episodes. I am your host, Ramses Ja, on all social media. Join us tomorrow as we share our news with our voice from our perspective, right here on the Black Information Network Daily Podcast.